Now, there have been many discussions about categories versus dimensions. And in the end, I think you probably all realize that you can always break a dimension into categories, or you can always smush out your categories into dimensions. But one of the principles that we were presented with for DSM-5 was to try to be more dimensional. It's not clear what that means exactly, but there are good things about being dimensional. It's very important for neurobiological research. I mean, that's part of the pressure. For genetics, having quantitative traits gives you much power. You saw in some of the studies presented earlier about brain function that many of the people studying brain function want quantitative traits. For outcome measures, we really need quantitative traits, and that was illustrated earlier in Sally's talk about the interventions, where you just, or actually Jonathan Green's, where if you just have a category, you're limited in what you can say. And dimensions are good for screening. If you're trying to figure out who should I try to see, if you have dimensions, you can use that information in different ways. On the other hand, if you're trying to maximize specificity, that is, try to just see children with autism, then categories make more sense. Categories tend to have stronger psychometrics in the sense that it's easier for me to say, yes, ASD, no ASD, than here is a range, and we're all going to agree on what range a child has. That's much harder to get people to agree about. And we need categories on some level for access to services. Theoretically, in the U.S., every child gets the education which is necessary for them, but the reality is school systems say you get this if you have autism, and if you don't have autism, you don't get this. So we are stuck putting kids in categories even when we don't like it. And in research, we have to have groups. We have to decide who are we going to study and who are we not going to study. So where are we going? I think that many of us in the States who have done research and had research-based clinics as well as clinics feel like we need to figure out how to be more efficient. You know, we can't be giving an ADI, an ADAS, and a 10 or 15-hour assessment. No one will pay for this. On the other hand, if we're going to try to be making faster diagnoses, we have to narrow our comparisons. We can't have a diagnosis that applies to a 2-year-old who has not begun to speak, a 10-year-old who is verbally fluent, and a 40-year-old who has never spoken, and have the same criteria exactly in order to rule out. When we're looking at 2-year-olds, we really need to be comparing to other 2-year-olds. Or if we're looking to 10-year-olds, we need to be comparing to other 10-year-olds who can talk or 10-year-olds who cannot talk. So we need more specific age-related examples, and we need to focus on what are we trying to do. So that's my introduction, flying you into the draft proposals for DSM-5. And actually, some of this, many of you probably saw, I presented at IMFAR, I think 2 years ago now. Some has changed and some is the same. So things may look familiar and they may not. The first proposal is to just have one spectrum of autism spectrum disorders and call it autism spectrum disorders, not PDD. Okay. So this will eliminate different classifications within ASD, such as PDD-NOS, Asperger's syndrome, childhood degenerative disorder. It will also eliminate separate autism categories for known etiologies, such as Fragile X or Rett syndrome. One of the most controversial aspects of this proposal has been what happens to Asperger's syndrome. And I think the logic here is multi-step. One piece of logic of not having a separate Asperger's syndrome is that the scientific validity for Asperger's syndrome is very questionable. So once you control for level of language, many of the differences that people find in terms of Asperger's versus autism disappear. And there isn't good evidence to say that these are truly different groups if you control for how fluently someone can speak. I think another concern was that in the current diagnostic criteria, the emphasis was often on early history of language delay, like what age a child had phrases and words. And it turns out, and I think Sally talked a little bit about it and a number of the other speakers, that that is much less important than what you can do now. What can a person tell you now? So one of the concerns was that many individuals end up changing diagnosis. They may start out as autism because their language is delayed, move into Asperger's because people stop asking about that, and then they may move back into autism because they need autism services. And this seemed potentially harmful for many people with no scientific justification. I also wanted to give you just a quick example, I think that where we were really surprised about what happened in terms of distinctions within ASD. As I said, in our research, we had found that clinicians in our group making distinctions actually improved predictability on top of the standard diagnostic instruments. But in a big study that involved 12 sites around the US, all of whom were trained to use the same diagnostic protocol, a long one with the ADI, the ADAS, intelligence testing, language testing, the behavioral testing, we then told people, make your own diagnoses in the end. Do whatever you would do. Okay. And in fact, when we looked at these 12 sites, the distributions of the scores, this is repetitive behavior scores from the ADI, the distributions were quite similar. So there was a big range within any site, but no site had everybody very severe or everybody very low. They all hovered around the same median. This is the same thing for ADAS scores. But when we looked at what diagnoses the clinicians made at these sites, they were all over the place. So they were essentially describing the same range of children in each site, but here, one site said everyone had pure autism. Another site said most people had PDD-NOS, that's the red. Some sites said quite a lot of Asperger's, some PDD-NOS, some autism. So again, describing the same range of children, and they had the same information. So this wasn't that they didn't bother to ask. And then we looked at what variables predicted who got what diagnoses. Like who, this is down here, the green is Asperger's, pink is PDD. And these are the variables. The greatest predictor, this is in 973 kids, was the ADAS calibrated severity score, which is not what we were expecting, but that's okay. But then the next predictor was sight. So if you went to Missouri or you went to University of Washington, you would be called autism. If you, the same person, went to other institutions, you might get called PDD-NOS. We then followed it down, and sites were not being random. It wasn't that they just, oh, let's call them Asperger's today. It was that everyone had their own cutoffs. So we had 3 institutions where Asperger's seemed to be an IQ over 118. We had 3 other institutions where Asperger's was an IQ over 80. Okay. We had, some sites where kids who were very agitated were never called Asperger's, and other sites where people who were very agitated were called, and irritable were called Asperger's. So it wasn't illogical, it was just not the same. Okay. And the worst thing is that for 3 sites, the number one predictor controlling everything else for whether you got called Asperger or PDD-NOS versus autism was your mother's level of education. So this does not seem good. On the other hand, we're very aware that care needs to be taken here. I don't think anyone wants to abolish the term Asperger's or tell people who define themselves as having Asperger's that they don't have a diagnosis or cannot use that term. The idea is to include Asperger's within autism, recognize and be more forthright about the huge effect that spoken language ability has on options. So be very clear that we always need to consider how well can someone talk and understand language, and then also be even more clear about the huge spectrum of autism, and that no two people with autism are the same, and that just because you have an autism diagnosis does not mean that you belong in a certain group or going to a certain class. Okay. So the next issue, and I know I'm just barreling along here, is how many domains should be in DSM-5? And the proposal is to move down from the 3 domains, which are social, communication, and restricted and repetitive, to 2 domains, one of which is social communication, and the other's restricted interests and repetitive behaviors. None of the behaviors are gone. They've all been incorporated into this, so we're not tossing anything out except language delay. And the idea here is that language delay should be considered independent of autism features. It should be considered before you even think about a diagnosis. You need to figure out how well can this person talk and understand language. Okay. There are many studies with normal populations that have shown 3 different domains, and I've talked about perhaps biologically separate factors in speech and language, social, and repetitive behaviors to contribute. And I think that that is important, but those are studies of normal populations, and they're studies using brief questionnaires with parents who mostly have never met someone with autism. When you look at studies of individuals with developmental disabilities or autism, you find that these things are not independent. No. And partly probably in the normal population, these are independent because there are many people with language delays who do not have autism. So that is separate. But when you move into looking at the populations we're interested in, that's not true. Okay, I just said this. And we don't know why, but it also appears that repetitive behaviors for some reason go along with significant social deficits. I mean, we've heard a little bit in the beginnings of hypotheses, and I think this was partly Nancy Minshew's point yesterday, that there is something that is more than the sum of its parts in autism. So where is DSM-5 going? Well, in the category of social communication, there are 3 subdomains. The criteria are going to be stricter in the sense that a child or adult with ASD must have evidence of deficits in each of these domains. So it's no more 2 out of 6, 1 out of 5. It's something in each of these. But what we have tried to do is to provide a non-exhaustive list of examples in each of the domains. So these examples are not things that you have to have. They are examples. And you can come up with, as clinicians, your own examples. And the idea is that you should have multiple examples of deficits in social emotional reciprocity. And they could be anything from abnormal social approaches, a baby who backs into their parents, failing to have conversation, reduced sharing of interests, or lack of interest in social initiation. But it could be other things as well.